Welcome back. Last lecture, we built the logical foundation for hypothesis testing. We talked about null hypotheses, alternative hypotheses, p-values as conditional probabilities, and alpha as a decision threshold. Today we're going to apply that logic. We're going to start running actual tests. The most commonly used family of tests in psychology is the t-test. But the t-test isn't a single test. It's a family of 3 related tests. Which one you use depends on your design. The single sample t-test asks, does this group's mean differ from some known or hypothesized value? The paired t-test, also called the dependent samples or repeated measures t-test, asks, did scores change between 2 measurements taken from the same participants? And the independent samples t-test asks, do 2 separate unrelated groups differ from each other? Today, we focus on the first 2, the single sample t-test and the paired t-test. These are the tests we'll be running in this week's workshop. The independent samples t-test gets its own dedicated treatment in week 10. All 3 tests share the same underlying logic. A t-statistic compared against a t-distribution. So understanding the first 2 gives you most of the conceptual framework you'll need. Let's start with the simplest case, the single sample t-test. It's used when you have one group of observations and you want to know whether their mean differs from some specific reference value, usually a population norm or a theoretically meaningful benchmark. Here's a concrete example. A standardized anxiety scale has a general population mean of 50. A researcher recruits 40 first-year psychology students and measures their anxiety. The sample mean comes out at 56. Is this different from the population norm? Or could a 6-point difference arise just from sampling variability, even if first-year students are no more anxious than anyone else? That's the question. And to answer it, we weigh the observed difference against the expected amount of random variability. That ratio is the t-statistic. The numerator is the signal, the difference between your sample mean and the reference value. Here, 56 minus 50 equals 6. The denominator is the noise, the standard error of the mean. This is the standard deviation of your sample divided by the square root of your sample size. It tells you how much a sample mean would bounce around across repeated samples of this size. With larger samples, the standard error is smaller. You get more stable estimates. With more variability within your sample, the standard error is larger. So the formula is t equals m minus the mu divided by s divided by square root of n. Where m is your sample mean, mu o is the hypothesized reference value, and s is your sample standard deviation, and n is your sample size. If the t-statistic is large, meaning the observed difference is large relative to the noise, that's evidence against the null. If it's small, the observed difference is the kind of thing you'd often see just by chance. That's not much evidence at all. The t-distribution depends on something called degrees of freedom, or df. Degrees of freedom is roughly, and I'm simplifying here, the number of observations you have minus the number of parameters you're estimating. The degrees of freedom for a single sample t-test is simply n minus 1. With 40 students, that's 39 degrees of freedom. Once you have a t-statistic, you need to know whether it's surprising if the null is true. You compare it to a t-distribution. The t-distribution is similar to the normal distribution, bell-shaped, centered at 0. But it has heavier tails, especially with small samples. Why? Because when your sample is small, your estimate of the population standard deviation is uncertain. You're estimating it from limited data. The t-distribution accounts for that extra uncertainty by spreading probability into the tails. As sample size increases, the t-distribution converges toward the normal distribution. With large samples, the extra uncertainty about the standard deviation becomes negligible. The shape of the t-distribution is controlled by degrees of freedom. Fewer degrees of freedom means heavier tails, meaning a given t-statistic produces a less extreme p-value. As degrees of freedom increase, the same t-statistic becomes more significant. In practice, statistical software handles all of this. You'll see output showing a t-statistic, degrees of freedom, and a p-value. The interpretation is the same as always. If p is below alpha, you reject the null. If not, you don't. Now for the paired t-test. This is where the design gets more interesting. Suppose you want to know whether a mindfulness program reduces stress. You recruit 30 students. You measure their stress at the start of semester before the intervention. You deliver the program. Then you measure their stress again at the end. Every participant has 2 scores, a before score and an after score. Your question is, on average, did stress go down? You might be tempted to treat these as 2 separate groups, the before scores as one group and the after scores as another. But that would be wrong because these aren't independent groups. They're the same people measured twice. Each before score and after score are linked. They belong to the same individual. Here's the key insight that makes paired t-tests elegant. A paired t-test is just a single sample t-test run on different scores. For each participant, compute one number, their after score minus their before score. If stress decreased, that difference is negative. If it increased, it's positive. If nothing changed, it's 0. Now you have a single column of 30 numbers, one difference per person. Your question is now, is the mean of these differences significantly different from 0? That's a single sample t-test. Mean difference versus the hypothesized value of 0. The t-statistic, the t-distribution, the p-value, it all works exactly the same way. The formula becomes t equals mdiff divided by sdiff divided by square root of n, where mdiff is the mean of the different scores, sdiff is their standard deviation, and n is the number of pairs. The degrees of freedom for a paired t-test is the number of pairs minus 1. With 30 participants, that's 29 degrees of freedom. Now, why is this design powerful? Because it eliminates between-person variability. Different people have different baseline stress levels. Some people are naturally anxious. Some are naturally calm. In a paired design, that between-person variability disappears from the analysis because you're looking only at the change within each person. The chronically anxious person might go from 80 to 72. The naturally calm person might go from 35 to 30. Both show a reduction of similar magnitude. The paired design captures that, whereas treating them as 2 independent groups would bury the signal in noise. This is why within subjects designs are often preferred when the research question allows for them. The same participants measured twice gives you more statistical power, the ability to detect real effects, than 2 independent groups of the same total size. When you run a paired t-test in Jamovi, you'll see output something like this. A table showing t equals minus 2.41, df equals 29, p equals 0.023. How do you read this? Well, the t-statistic is minus 2.41. The negative sign tells you the scores went down. the after scores were lower than the before scores. The absolute value of 2.41 is what matters for significance. With 29 degrees of freedom and a t-statistic of this size, the probability of seeing a difference this large or larger if the null were true is 0.023, about 2.3%. That's less than alpha of 0.05, so you reject the null. There is evidence that stress decreased following the intervention. For a single sample t-test, the output looks the same. A t-value, degrees of freedom, and a p-value. The only difference is the degrees of freedom is n minus 1 rather than pairs minus 1. Now here's the part of this lecture that matters most for how you'll read research for the rest of your career. A significant p-value tells you the effect probably isn't zero. It tells you almost nothing about how big the effect is. Let me show you this with two pair design studies. Both ask whether a mindfulness program reduces student stress. Study A, 20 participants. Mean stress before the intervention, 60. Mean stress after, 52. The mean difference, 8 points. It's a small sample, so the standard error is relatively large, but the signal is strong enough. P equals 0.04. Study B has 2,000 participants. Mean stress before was 60. Mean stress after, 59.2. The mean difference, 0.8 points. The sample is enormous, so even this tiny signal is detectable. The p equals 0.04. Same p-value, both studies reject the null. Both found an effect. But look at what was actually found. In Study A, an 8-point reduction with 20 people. In Study B, a 0.8-point reduction with 2,000 people. These are not the same result. Study A found a potentially meaningful effect. An 8-point drop in stress might genuinely improve how students feel. Study B found a result that, while real, is probably too small to matter in practice. Students' stress barely moved. The p-value cannot distinguish these two cases. In both studies, p equals 0.04. The p-value is a measure of evidence against the null. But evidence that a large effect exists and evidence that a tiny effect exists can produce identical p-values. This is why the American Statistical Association, in a landmark 2016 statement authored by Wasserstein and Lazar, emphasized explicitly that statistical significance is not equivalent to scientific, human, or economic significance. The ASA also made several connected points that apply directly to how you interpret research. P-values do not tell you the probability the null hypothesis is true. They only tell you how surprising the data would be if the null were true. You cannot invert that statement. And p-values are vulnerable to p-hacking, making analytical decisions about which variables to include, which participants to exclude, and when to stop collecting data based on whether those choices move the p-value below 0.05. If you try enough analytic variations on the same data, random chance alone will eventually produce a significant result. The published p-value from a p-hacked analysis looks identical to one from a clean, pre-specified analysis, which is why pre-registration, committing to your analysis plan before seeing the data, matters so much. For decades, psychology treated p less than 0.05 as the gold standard of evidence. Publish if you clear it, bury it if you don't. The result has been publication bias, inflated effect sizes in the literature, and a replication crisis where findings that looked robust simply don't hold up when other labs try to reproduce them. You'll also notice, reading published papers, that researchers sometimes describe non-significant results as approaching significance, marginally significant, or trending towards significance. There is no such statistical category. Alpha is a decision rule. Either the result cleared the threshold or it didn't. When you see that language, treat it as a flag. The threshold wasn't met, and the researcher is framing it charitably. Evaluate the evidence on its own terms. The solution is not to abandon p-values. They're a useful piece of evidence. The solution is to always report effect sizes alongside them. Effect sizes tell you how big the difference is, independent of sample size, and we'll cover that in detail starting next week. Let me give you a quick check question. A researcher measures sleep quality in 50 students before and after a sleep hygiene workshop. The mean difference in scores is 2.1 points on a 20-point scale. The paired t-test gives t equals 2.3, degrees of freedom 49, p equals 0.025. What can the researcher conclude, and what additional information is needed? Here's the answer. The researcher can conclude that sleep quality changed significantly. A difference this large would be unusual if the intervention had no effect at all. But they cannot conclude that improvement is practically meaningful from the p-value alone. A 2.1 point change on a 20-point scale might be meaningful, or it might be trivial. The p-value doesn't tell you. An effect size measure is needed to evaluate the magnitude of the change, independent of sample size. We've now covered two members of the t-test family. You understand what the t-statistic measures, how to interpret t-test output, and critically, why a significant p-value doesn't tell you whether an effect is practically important. In week 10, we bring in the third member of the family, the independent samples t-test, for situations where two completely separate groups are compared, and within subjects pairing isn't possible. And we operationalize effect size. You'll learn Cohen's d, what it is, how it's calculated, and how to interpret it using conventional benchmarks. You'll see what small, medium, and large effects actually look like. And you'll learn how to report a p-value and an effect size together so that your results communicate both whether an effect is real and whether it matters. See you in week 10. Bye.